Okay, wonderful. So it's great to have a couple of new people and maybe some others who didn't get to raise their hands. I'm going to ask the forbearance of those of us who are on that to get us kicked off tonight. We're going to go through the slides very quickly. And I see that Dr. Goodman has joined us, so that who's one of our speakers on Friday, so that she can add in a little bit. So just for some context, this is the Be More Human series sponsored by the In the Loop ministry group of the Presbytery of Baltimore. There are 6 ministry groups, and In the Loop is one of those 6 and primarily represents the 12 Presbyterian churches that are within Baltimore City, hence In the Loop being the Beltway. We all have, all the ministry groups have interesting names, and we are in the Baltimore Beltway Loop. This series is being offered in hopes that it starts dialogue among us, that it creates awareness, that we begin to think about the social and racial justice issues in our country in a different way. Those who are Black among us and those who are white among us have different perspectives, but we all still, I would say, suffer from lack of information. And hopefully this series is going to help us broaden our perspectives. So we're calling this first few sessions of our series the 1619 Project, and that derives from the New York Times 1619 Project, where they had a series of articles they published in August of 2019, which was the 400th anniversary of the structured, formal, organized transatlantic slave trade. There was slavery in the United States prior to 1619, but that is looked upon as the initiation of the transatlantic slave trade. So we are sponsoring these sessions on the 16th and 19th of the month, the 16th being where we have more presentation of information, and then the 19th where we'll actually go into small groups to discuss our thoughts and perhaps even develop some actions that we can take to counteract some of the issues. So tonight we're going to be speaking about, I'm sorry about my co-host, he'll stop in a sec. We're going to be talking about some of the issues that surround wealth. Wealth being different than the money we have to spend on a daily basis to sustain ourselves, the salaries that we get, but rather the money, considerable money sometimes, that is passed down through generations, that is more material possessions such as house, real estate or business, and that kind of thing. So we are looking at the legacy of slavery in this series, and one of the areas that we're all familiar with is the concept of the 40 acres and a mule. So that upon being freed, slaves, families were given property, I think primarily along Florida and Georgia, South Carolina, that had been white-owned property in 40-acre allotments and mules that were borrowed from the Union Army. That 40 acres and a mule could have been a mechanism to begin Black family wealth. Certainly land and property is something that you can pass on to your children, your grandchildren. You can sustain yourself, make a living. It gives you the right to vote in that time. If you had to be a property owner by the particular state laws to vote, it was an important step for freed slaves. That was a field order that was given by General William Sherman in 1865, but then rescinded by Andrew Johnson when President Lincoln was killed. And the quote we have here from Andrew Johnson is that this is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men. Johnson declared in 1866, rescinding the act and taking away the 40 acres. Just as a picture, a snapshot of Black non-wealth, that being money accumulated through families and generations. The median family wealth for white people in the United States is $171,000 compared to $17,600 for Black people. So it's a very steep gradient. Having access to money enables one to secure credit, to build, to finance family advancement in ways that are not available to Black people. And these are broad generalities, so we understand that. So in the early 1900s, in the post-Civil War era, through Reconstruction and later segregation, there was a general sentiment that Black should not be afforded the full citizenship or rights of whites, and that extended to wealth as well, that one could be too successful as a Negro, and there were many actions taken at a social level, a lot of local, state, and even some federal actions that were taken to minimize the financial advancement of Black people post-slavery. There were laws, there was personal organized violence, but in general, the idea that successful Blacks should be thwarted in their efforts. There were many laws and codes put into place, and even some of the laws that were put into place to help did not help, because the banking industry and local social norms still prevented Black people from being able to use, for instance, the GI Bill and other federal programs. We had a very interesting presentation about redlining in Baltimore by McKenna Llewellyn on Friday, which you won't have the benefit of tonight if you weren't available for that. But that session was recorded and is on the Presbytery's YouTube website if you would like to see more about that. So the civil rights movement largely ended many of the federal laws. However, there was still lingering institutionalized racism in hiring practices and education. We know about Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 that integrated schools, but we know that our schools still are not equal and fully integrated, that schools where Black children attend, the books are still likely to be used books, older books. Teachers are often, there are issues in education that persist to this day. There were some major violent acts through the early 1900s. We know that a lot of those violent acts persist now in terms of racial profiling, the Black Lives Movement, and police violence, and much of what we're seeing rise up in response to our current electoral process in terms of racial intolerance and hatred. But these events in particular were levied against Black people who were in successful Black communities that were found to be unacceptable by violent terrorists that killed many people, burned down businesses. We don't hear lots about these events, but they have occurred on this mass level. In 1933, there was the Homeowners Loan Corporation formed, but because of redlining and blockbusting, which McKenna talked to us in detail about on Friday, it still did not help Black families get loans to secure housing. And we know that housing is a major way of securing wealth for families. And the GI Bill we've spoken to a bit too. That too was a federal initiative, but Black veterans were discriminated against in getting mortgages freely. They were able to get mortgages in neighborhoods that were less desirable, or not get loans at all. One thing that we'd like to mention, since we're talking about wealth, is the idea of reparations. We hear a lot about that, and I think it's something interesting for us to discuss this evening in terms of our thoughts on this. These are not African Americans, they're Japanese Americans, and they were successful in achieving reparations for the period of time that they were interned during World War II, which did cause a lot of economic loss in terms of businesses and family wealth. The same idea of reparations for African Americans, families who endured slavery, has been discussed. It's a big topic. We're talking about 280 more years of actual slavery and a lot of economic deprivation in the years following that. So the idea of reparations is one that is large and complex for African Americans that were enslaved, whose ancestors were enslaved. It is a complex topic. And I'm going to turn to Susan here. I'm just rambling on a bit, but Susan's going to tell us a little bit more about what Presbyterians have been saying and thinking about this concept of reparations. Susan.
Thanks, Annette. So I just wanted to add that reparations is something that has been talked about by Presbyterians across the country. And back in 2001, so almost 20 years ago, there was a overture to General Assembly on the topic. And like good Presbyterians, we formed a task force. And the task force did a survey of Presbyterians. We have a research department within the national office, and they did a survey that included pastors and congregational leaders, elders, and members. And they had almost 1,000 people respond. And it was a lot about trying to understand what people knew about reparations and their attitudes towards it. I don't think you'd be too surprised that people were not, there were a lot of people that were not interested in having the church take a stance on reparations. Even though many of them admitted they were only partly familiar with what reparations meant. And they did agree that reparations had not occurred in any large scale, that we had done some things towards reparations and restitution, but that there was more to be done. That is coming back around again. There's a lot of discussion going on this last couple of years in particular, where people are revisiting this question about actual financial restitution. And I wanted to highlight that one of the aspects that would relate to our conversations tonight is that the report concludes with talking about the question of reconciliation. This is something we talk about a lot as people of faith, about being reconciled to God and being reconciled with one another. The report draws heavily on the Belhar Confession that comes out of South Africa, where there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission following the apartheid there. And so the question comes of whether or not we can move towards full reconciliation without some form of reparations or restitution. So I put that before you tonight. You're still muted, Annette.
McKenna or Kate Foster Connors or Regine, would you like to maybe just say a little bit about your presentations on Friday, just your takeaway points? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Just a summary of Friday.
Yeah, just something, just a little quick for those who weren't with us.
Sure. Well, Friday, Regine, do you want to go first? Would that make more sense? Or should I'll just talk about housing. So there are a number of different ways that we can identify the sort of white supremacist history of wealth inequality. And one of the clearest ways, because one of the primary ways that people build wealth in this country is through real estate and owning a home and building equity. One of the clearest ways to identify it is through looking through and sifting through the long history of white supremacist housing policy in this country. And it's particularly important to look at it in Baltimore because some of these policies are homegrown Baltimore policies. And so on Friday, we talked about four. We talked about the city council resolution and law that was enacted in 1911 that was a city segregation ordinance, the first of its kind in the country, and it was adopted widely after Baltimore put it into effect, that said people of different races, ethnicities, and religions couldn't live in the same neighborhoods as each other. And then we talked, Annette has already referenced it tonight, about redlining, the practice where the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the federal government asked local bankers, real estate agents, et cetera, to draw up maps of their cities and outline different neighborhoods in red to determine loan risk. But a lot of the data collected about the different neighborhoods had to do with race and immigration status and job status, and not actual risk of a loan. It was heavily influenced by demographic data. And then as soon as the court struck down those laws, white neighborhoods that largely Protestant neighborhoods had to find new ways to keep their neighborhoods all white because the courts had ruled their old policies illegal. And so they started creating neighborhood covenants that were written into the neighborhood association bylaws and into the deeds of the houses that said, if you bought a house in the neighborhood, you had to agree to sell to a white person when you sold. So a number of Baltimore neighborhoods had those covenants: Guilford, Homeland, Roland Park, and on and on. And they're extraordinarily difficult to remove from a neighborhood covenant because 100% of the residents have to agree to vote it out. So Rogers Forge just this past year agreed to vote it out of their neighborhood bylaws, even though they couldn't act on it for a long time. And then finally, we talked about blockbusting, a policy that I think was started in Chicago, the practice that was, I think, started in Chicago, but really took off here, where a predominantly or all white neighborhood would, mostly middle-class white neighborhoods, a real estate agent would come into the neighborhood and sell to a Black family one of the houses, and purposefully stir up fear and specifically with the white neighbors that Black people were moving into their neighborhood. The white people who were afraid that their home values would drop too quickly sold their houses at a low price back to the real estate agent, and the real estate agent would turn it around and sell it at double the price or create a really unfair rent to buy or rental contract for Black families. And so within a period of 8 to 10 years, a neighborhood would go from all white to almost all Black neighbors.
Thanks, McKenna. Regine, could you speak just a bit to your presentation? I'm not sure Regine is there.
There we go. I think the other aspect, you know, of what McKenna said is they picked on low income or middle income white neighborhoods. They didn't pick on high income neighborhoods. In other words, that's what they were trying to destroy. In my presentation, I just looked at a wide range of distributions in terms of wealth, income, and then the factors that contribute to wealth, home ownership, savings, all of this. And over time, and for reasons of law and structure, they have been established to prevent African Americans, et cetera, from accumulating wealth. And, you know, to accumulate wealth takes a lot of time. And if you don't have inheritances or have any intergenerational transfer of wealth, it takes even longer for people to build up a wealth in their family.
Thank you. I'm writing a message to my friend, Cynthia Body Willis. Hi, Cynthia. Glad you could come on tonight. I was interested in sharing a little bit about the Montgomery County work. In particular, I just wanted to share the statement in the document that you shared with me about the finding. So I'm just going to read this because it includes consideration of wealth. So Cynthia can help me if I misrepresent this. But there is a commission that Montgomery County has established that is going to look very critically, and a phrase I liked a lot in there, intentionally, at all of their activities across the board. So as they establish new legislation and projects, as their current departments go about their work, they are to specifically look at how the impact on racial justice and inequity. And I'm just going to read this little bit from there.
Annette, excuse me, you're coming off a bit weak in volume. If you could sit a little closer, I think people are having a little trouble hearing you.
Okay, thanks. So disparate outcomes among county residents include wealth, housing, criminal justice, education, and health. Inequitable outcomes linked to race and social justice will persist in the county without intentional intervention. The work to dismantle racial and social justice and inequity must occur on an individual, institutional, and structural basis. And all that sounds right to us, but I think I challenge us to think about the intentional intervention aspect of this and how pervasive government actions can be, and how they impact citizens. So where a highway is built, and we talked a little bit about Route 40 being built through Baltimore City and displacing Blacks. We talked about how highways have separated communities into more poor neighborhoods where residents are exposed to highway fumes and industrial waste. We've talked about how neighborhoods are food deserts and don't have the city services. We heard very effectively from Miss Mamie Sims, and I think I'll play the quotes of hers that we used, how just running a streetcar through communities separated communities and created inequities. And I think a lot of actions, as you go to the polls in a couple of weeks and you're voting on bond issues, how will they impact vulnerable and minority communities is an important consideration. So I'm going to share my screen once more to
most everybody,
play this
most all the black men worked at Paris Port or the shipyard because that's why they came migrated from the South to get a job at Paris Port. Now they didn't pay them a whole lot of money. They didn't come because of the money, but there was some money. And so we didn't live there. We lived, and then when we start moving on, what I call it moving on up in the neighborhood, they moved out. Because it wasn't a block that we moved in later that had not been all white. In Alabama and wherever else when Martin Luther King came along. And you mean to tell me you did not know or ever heard or read in a book in school about the 400-year history that blacks went through? Yes, most everybody. Most all the black men worked at Paris Port or the shipyard because that's why they came migrated from the South to get a job at Paris Port. Now they didn't pay them a whole lot of money. They didn't come because of the money, but there was some money.
Okay. So with that, that was very quick and a little disjointed perhaps, but we wanted to give you a little bit about what we were thinking of in terms of wealth and how racial injustice and the legacy of slavery have impacted our present communities. I think sometimes we accept things as they are. We try to understand why things are as they are, and we find fault and blame. We try to displace it away from ourselves and whatever part we may play in it. But as McKenna reminded us on Friday, nothing about how we're living today is accidental. Our communities, our educational system, our healthcare system, which we'll talk about more next month, the wealth disparities, none of that's by accident. The disproportionate number of Black people in poverty is not by accident. So with these thoughts, we're going to get into small groups, and we're going to talk a little bit about whether this is a social issue, a social structural issue, or an individual issue, and do a little thinking and talking about our own thoughts on poverty, wealth disparities. We're going to talk a little bit about our own thoughts about reparations and the appropriate role or not for that at this point in time in our society. And we're going to talk a little bit about the church's role. Susan's story about the Presbyterian Church's response to its culpability in early part of the century and centuries past, contributing to our current situation can be explored a little bit further. So before we go to our small groups, if you have a point that you think you'd like to make to the larger group, actually, let's not do this. Let's go to our small groups, and we can come back a little bit at the end to share some parts of our discussion. So Frank, I think we're ready to go to our groups. Okay, and that just one question, how long would you like to be in discussion? It's a few minutes past 7 now. I think till 7:30. Okie doke. Opening up. I'm sorry, I was just going to say, just so that everyone's aware, Frank will give us a warning and you'll have a couple minutes, Frank, to wrap up your discussions, but then you'll be automatically brought back to the large room. Thanks. Hi, have you gotten your group invitations? Aren't you leading a group? Can't hear you. I'm sorry. I could hear about myself talking in the background from a recording. Were you running a recording? I was not. Okay. I'll go back in the room and see if it's still going on, but there was 2 different streams of conversation. Oh, okay. You have to send me back to my room, or how do I go back? I was with George and Cynthia Body Willis and Yvette McGeekran. There should be a way on your end. Oh, sure is. I got it. Got it. Cool. I've assigned you to a breakout room. What can we do with this? If anyone wants to raise their hand.
Hello, everyone. I was in a breakout group 1. I'm Kenny Walker. Even though the questions was about reparations and what we can do to, I'm going to just say, even the playing field, we were covering a whole lot of subjects. I'm going to start with Hannah Cox. Our breakout group had Kathy Anderson, Hannah Cox, Loretta Parrish, Ray Jane Goodman, Jesse Lowry, Susan Crable, and McKenna Llewellyn, and myself. The question was brought up about socialism. Is it a good word or bad word? And Hannah says that she's a socialist, and I asked her definition of being a socialist. And she basically said the idea that everyone should have access to services on the same level. And it's hard to do in a national arena, but it could be done on a community level. And Loretta Parrish mentioned that in order to get the ball rolling as far as having that equal opportunity, that people need to get together, whites and blacks, and they need to be able to, the blacks and whites both need to be able to tell their story, and whoever's listening needs to listen and see, and what that does, that makes people realize that there's more in common than there is differences between one another. Regine talked about the change of structure and policies that could really help. And she gave an example of if you're renting and when you want to go buy a home, you have to give up that rental subsidy that you have in order to buy the house. Susan, Jesse, and McKenna has some great ideas. If they would unmute to speak about what they were talking about.
Well, Michelle has her hand up. So after her, who would you like to unmute?
Well, in my group, Susan, McKenna, or Jesse, if they have
okay.
hand.
Which one of you would like to offer your insights? Susan, McKenna, Jesse. I don't know if we have any takers there, Ken.
I was gonna say,
Okay.
Yeah, I feel like I've talked enough.
Okay.
Moving on to Michelle, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Mine was a general question about the report that Susan Crable shared earlier, the report of the Task Force to Study Reparations from 2004. If my question will take us in a different direction, I can withhold, but I would like to ask it at some point before we close. So is that is this an okay time? Yes, okay. So I would like to know, since that GA was before my time or interest, like knowing what was happening at GA, I would love to know what is going on now, and if it died in the water in 2004, if it was too controversial and was tabled, or if it devolved into let's just keep talking about this and learning rather than action, and what we can do now here in this presbytery to reopen that conversation if there's some energy or interest in that on a local level. So anyone have any interest in answering that question?
yeah, so the specific one did direct the Office of Public Witness, the DC office, to support some advocacy around what was legislation at the time, which didn't get anywhere. And then it's just been followed up with studies and reports since then around a lot of what we've been doing here, dismantling racism, building beloved community. There have been other proposals, but the reparations piece has not gotten a lot of traction until, again, recently people are talking about it now, both as a legislative vehicle, as a US government response, but also increasingly within the church. What's presbyteries, general assemblies, what is our response in terms of financial reparations from within the church body, right? Because church property is owned and held primarily at the presbytery level, right? And there are decisions we've made around property as a church body, distinct from the policies of government. So that's what I know up until now.
Susan, has there been any activity to join other advocacy groups around this issue, or even just to present a statement, a general statement about the Presbytery's position, or is that also complex?
Yeah, I haven't heard any recent public statements come out. I've just heard people saying it's time to come back to it, but I haven't heard of anything moving. But I'd also be willing to go back and talk to our folks in DC and see if they're hearing any more movement. I think most of the focus in recent times legislatively has been more around justice reform, police reform, some of those kinds of issues.
We have a local ministry team or commission, don't we, on racial issues in the Presbytery?
We have the Dismantling Racism team, whose primary mandate is to organize trainings for the pastors and certain leaders within the Presbytery as a first step towards getting our churches more engaged on this. So we serve as kind of a resource as well on these topics. But we do not have an organized Presbytery kind of advocacy response on public policy. That's beyond what we're doing.
Thank you, Susan. My follow-up question is about the local effort of the Episcopal Church for the money that they put forward for reparations in the Baltimore City area, and curious if there has been any energy or interest in the Presbyterians following suit.
There hasn't been any formal discussion that I've heard of. If others have heard about it, I know of work like that in other presbyteries, but I've not heard anybody bring that to the floor here. So I'd be curious, interested.
There was another hand up that went down. Was Jessie Lowry? Did you have your hand up?
That was me. And it's, I'm really interested in what Michelle's talking about. I actually didn't know about the Episcopal Church locally doing that, but yeah, I think churches can be leading the way. We don't have to wait for the higher up national. I don't think we will find our national government led by anyone urging us to do these things. We have to lead the way. I'm very grateful that like in our church, there are some opportunities like that we can point to that lots of people are contributing to, I hope. Like I just saw in the Presbyterian Mission publication that a whole big spread about the Katie Cannon Scholarship. And I'm going to be urging our mission committee to give to that. I would love to see, I said in our group that like Princeton Seminary, which is Presbyterian, did that whole study about their institution's connection to slavery, and they are setting aside $27 million for scholarships just designated towards descendants of slavery. But I think they could go even a step further. And all of us like thinking of ways to divest from or take risks with the wealth, the white wealth that is like upholding us. So for instance, with the seminary, there's no reason why we should have dorms named the exact same thing as Princeton University, named after white slaveholders, like literally 2 dormitories in one little 5 square mile town named after the same guy. It's ridiculous. Like, but I know that renaming would be a whole big headache because they probably lose funding, legacies and legacies of funding. And to pull that down on the local church level, I'm sure that we all have stories like that of things that we could do that would be taking a risk. But I'm really interested in conversations like that with other pastors of how we can kind of lead the way on that.
Michelle, was there anything else? Did you have any other follow-up questions, Michelle? Sorry, you're muted. And then George Fisher.
Oh, that's okay. I had left my hand raised on accident.
Right.
I'm glad that you spoke up, Jessie. I think if that was going to happen, I know that our endowment is really complicated because other churches have their investments in the endowment that Presbytery has. So if we were going to do something, it would take a lot of careful, like surgical dissection of the endowment, which we would have to be very ready for some kind of power analysis of who has money where and who's willing to do that kind of work. So if we do have the stomach for that, then yeah, it's worth it. But it won't be an easy thing to do because we have multiple churches that have pooled their funds together to invest with the Presbytery because our finances seem fairly complicated from what I understand. But I think it's worth it if we're willing to actually put the time in to do it. So, Barbara Francis.
Actually, George Fisher was.
Oh, George, sorry. I'll be quiet now.
That's okay.
I just wanted to support what Jesse was suggesting, that we take on something that's a little bit more local, a little bit more doable than waiting for the national atmosphere to change and really get something done. One thing that occurred to me is that we could do a fairly careful study of the history of all of these things and the way different churches within the Presbytery have moved, the way they have influenced one another. I've heard it said, for example, that Madison Avenue was formed by the folks who drove, I think it was it First and Franklin? The people who drove First and Franklin parishioners to First and Franklin and then formed their own church. They weren't allowed to meet in First and Franklin, and they developed their own. A lot of these little stories could provide some cultural background. And I was initially on the Dismantling Racism Committee, and at that time, Ken Kovacs was planning to put together a study of just this sort of thing. How had racism actually affected the church community, the Presbyterian church community in Baltimore? And I was wondering if anyone knows whether that's happening. Did that go forward, or did it just disappear as a good idea that never happened? Susan, do you know?
So there's only been very small work done on it. We were actually tried to get a few people to put together a group. It's a pretty comprehensive task at hand.
Yeah.
We gathered some of it through the Dismantling Racism trainings themselves, getting people to share that history and collect it. But it's a huge undertaking. And there are a lot of financial decisions that have been made. As you said, Madison Avenue grew out of First and Franklin. They were worshiping there, and then were started at the time they couldn't even own property, and so others had to own that. So there's times when the church is moved and the Presbytery allowed them to sell. There's one church that sold their property in the city for $0, right? And then started over again in the suburbs and presumably got financial support for that. So we also, make inconsistent decisions depending on what the church is. And so not only is the collective wealth that Michelle's talking about impacted, but our individual wealth as congregations as well is an example of how the differences in wealth accumulation. But yes, it's definitely an ongoing project, and we definitely need help.
And it's one that involves the churches within the loop. I mean, they would be some of the principal actors. And so it seems to me that there might be a way of connecting and doing something together there.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's an opportunity in small bites to actually get paid folks to do some of the research.
Yeah.
Loop is in the process of forming its budget. I could see perhaps that we might engage somebody to work with our 12 churches to help build some history out of them. We have looked off and on for opportunities to hire young people, maybe a young person that's in the Youth Rising Coalition, or a minority college student who's studying history, or a graduate student we could engage to help us a little bit at a time build that knowledge.
I think that's a great idea.
Audrey, can we hear from Barbara unless you had something to say on this subject?
I was just going to say that I think this is a great idea to do some local work, and Baltimore Presbytery in the past has been a leader nationally in some of our social justice issues. I'm saying that broadly, but this might be an example of something that we could do and then share with other other presbyteries and other parts of the church. That's all.
Yeah.
I would like to say something if I could. Hi, George Fisher. I've seen you in a different place than down at St. Vincent's. Deborah, could you please tell me, because I didn't catch the name of the very articulate 92-year-old woman, or could she tell me herself?
Miss Mamie Sims.
Excuse me?
Mamie Sims.
Mamie Sims. Hi, Mrs. Sims. You were extraordinarily articulate in our group, and it made me want to run away. And I sat and listened because what you said was accurate. When Michelle said about the complications, I thought to myself, what a white word that we always use when we're talking finances, complications. It allows us to write one more report and not get off our duff and do one more thing. And I was sort of distressed by it. It's sort of the same way I was distressed by the financial crisis that was created by a bunch of lawyers and white people and did what it did. And so what pulls me away from the church, and I'm not nearly as theologically based as all of you, is I don't see much action, and it really distresses me. And I'm a parishioner of Brown, and when everybody voted to do the multi-million-dollar renovations, when right across the street there were roofs that were falling down in Black churches, I simply didn't understand it, and I stopped giving anything. So now I give directed giving. I give to something that is needed. I give it to a child. I give it to St. Francis. I do something else. So I don't know what the answer is, but this has been going on for such a long time. We can write another report, or we can decide to have a fund that gives down payments so people can buy houses. We can stop we can start really looking at salaries and pension plans and stuff like that, because there are a lot of people that don't make $150,000 a year. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that goes on. And so I, as an older white person, certainly don't know how to shoulder what I didn't see and take responsibility for it. But boy, I would like to know somewhere to put action. So that's all I have to say. And I thank you all for doing this. And I thank McKenna particularly for and her program, and Annette for bringing the program on Friday night. It was excellent. Thank you. That's it.
All right, thank you. I think on that note, we have a lot of actions that have been brought forward that we can take or do something about. I know that when we have our interweek meeting this Thursday, if you're on the call and you are in the loop person, you'll get an email about this, that this is a topic that we can bring up with our 2021 budget. I think it's great. Just want to point out that we will be coming back together on the 16th and 19th of November. We'll be talking about health disparities. There will be a posting on the Presbytery's website with the podcast and the article that we'll be basing that discussion on. And I hope that it's been a very rich discussion tonight. I hope that it will move some of us to action. Everything that we've been talking about this session has been recorded and will be on the Presbytery's YouTube site, and that access is available through, how will they get access to that YouTube site? You're posting things?
Actually, excuse me, everything's live right now on YouTube, and there's a playlist devoted to the Be More Human sessions. I'll drop that link in the chat in just a second.
Okay, so why don't you do that, and we'll try to make sure it's someplace, perhaps in the group webpage or someplace that's continually accessible. So thank you all for taking the time to be here tonight. It's important, and we appreciate you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you so much, Annette, for your guidance and your work.
Thanks all of us, so thank you all.